Hi, everyone. I'm Sandra Dugan with Colorado Rising. Welcome to the second installation of our air quality monitoring seminar. This is part of a series that we have been taking part in to share with you all a little bit about the air quality monitoring endeavors across the state and particularly in northern Colorado. I'm going to pass this over to our friend from Larimer Alliance, Ed Behan, who will do a brief introduction for us.
Thank you, Sandra. And good evening, everybody, and welcome to Northern Colorado Air Quality. What can we do? My name is Ed Behan. I'm Media and Outreach Liaison for the Larimer Alliance for Health, Safety, and the Environment. And as Sandra mentioned, we're presenting this webinar along with our good friends and allies in Colorado Rising, who have provided invaluable insight and support in preparing this, the second in our series of webinars on air quality in Northern Colorado. I'd like to provide a brief background for both of our organizations. Colorado Rising was started in 2016 to provide advocacy and education on critical issues related to environmental degradation in Colorado. They are focused on impacts the oil and gas industry has had on our air quality and the livability of our homes, particularly those in disproportionately affected communities. Colorado Rising works within the community by supporting and expanding movement capacity building at the local level, phone banking, circulating petitions, and encouraging turnout for public meetings. They collect personal stories through petitions to raise the voices of impacted residents. This movement building was successful in achieving air quality monitoring in Erie. They also rallied support for improved oil and gas rules after the passage of SB 181, which changed the mission of the COGCC from fostering the industry to more carefully regulating it. Working with a range of communities and groups, Colorado Rising is a welcome and fierce ally in the cause of environmental justice. The Larimer Alliance arose in 2019, also following the passage of SB 181. Besides changing the COGCC's mission, that legislation mandated local governments could set their own standards for oil and gas regulation. The Alliance started when the Larimer County Commissioners authorized a task force, which was heavily industry friendly, to help prepare new rules. We lobbied with allies for a moratorium on oil and gas permits in Larimer County until new regulations were passed both locally and at the state level. When the county commissioners in 2019 insisted the county prepare new rules rather than wait for state guidance, we advocated for the strongest regulations possible. What passed then was woefully inadequate. However, with the opportunity to work with our current commissioners elected in 2020, a second round of oil and gas rules was enacted for Larimer County. They were better, and they could be better still. But the Alliance continues our advocacy for improved air quality monitoring and effective implementation of existing rules. As I said, this is the second webinar that the Alliance and Colorado Rising have sponsored on the issue of our poor air quality along the Front Range. In our session in March, we had experts address the nature of our bad air quality, the poor health outcomes resulting from that, and efforts made to document the emissions contributing to the problem, much of which is a direct result of poorly operated oil and gas facilities. A link to a recording of that session can be found in the chat section of this Zoom session. In the course of this evening's program, you'll have the opportunity to sign a couple of petitions, one from the Larimer Alliance and Colorado Rising, calling for both Larimer County and the city of Fort Collins to establish a comprehensive, continuous, real-time air quality monitoring station. The other is sponsored by Colorado Rising in collaboration with concerned residents of Loveland, opposing the fracking sites near the Centera neighborhood that have been proposed by the McWhinney Company. Our speakers tonight will include Andrew Klooster, Colorado field advocate for Earthworks, whose field observations using FLIR-enabled optical imaging have documented the unseen emissions that are rampant at oil and gas sites around the state. Christian van Wodenberg, a former trustee of the town of Erie, who was instrumental in establishing a comprehensive air quality monitoring station in his community and can speak to the value of the data collected to inform residents of hazardous conditions. Mike Foote, who is a lawyer specializing in environmental law on behalf of many groups, communities, and individuals. As a former state legislator who co-sponsored SB 181, he can address some of the ramifications of current regulations and the potential for future legislation. These gentlemen will then join a panel discussion with key local leaders and experts to further illuminate the issue and pragmatic approaches to monitoring and enforcement. The panel will also entertain your questions, and we encourage you to submit those questions via the chat function here in Zoom. While we can't guarantee we'll get to all your questions, we can assure you it will be a lively and informative session. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Sandra Dugan and Kate Brown from Colorado Rising, who will be moderating tonight's proceedings. Sandra?
Thanks, Ed. I'm having a little bit of difficulty with my screen sharing, so bear with me. I'm going to try one more time now. Can you all see my screen? No. Yeah, it's telling me that Christiane is sharing. Okay, well, that's okay. We'll just walk you through. Like Ed said, we'll be hearing from a variety of panelists today. So I want to just go over the agenda very quickly with everyone. First, we'll be hearing from Andrew Klooster from Earthworks, who will be talking about some air quality monitoring measures that he has taken and how we can continue to monitor the industry. We will then be hearing from Christiane Van Woudenberg on air quality monitoring in practice. And following that, we'll be hearing from Mike Foote, who'll be talking about air quality legislation. And then around 6:50 or 7, we'll start our question and answer portion with our expert panel. And then we will be concluding tonight's events. So that's a little bit of an overview of what we're doing tonight. Like Ed said, please feel free to share questions as they kind of pop in to your head on the question and answer portion at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any comments, you're welcome to utilize the chat. And with that, I will turn it over to Andrew Klooster.
Thank you. And let's hope that I can share my screen. Otherwise, this might be very difficult. Is everyone seeing my screen? Perfect. All right. So my name is Andrew Klooster. Good evening, folks. You should be somewhat familiar with me if you tuned into the previous webinar in this series, because I presented on that webinar some of our fieldwork findings with our optical gas imaging camera of oil and gas pollution in the state of Colorado. And tonight, I'm going to also share some visuals of pollution, but we're mainly going to talk about how we can be engaged in the oversight and monitoring of oil and gas pollution in the state of Colorado, and in particular, how you can be engaged in that effort. So I'm going to kind of focus on two main things. First of all, we're going to talk about filing complaints with the state of Colorado. And when I say the state of Colorado, I'm in particular talking about two different regulatory agencies, the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. These are the two agencies that regulate oil and gas activities in the state. They both have separate forms online on their websites by which citizens can inform them of issues and concerns about specific oil and gas facilities. And I'm going to walk you through using both of those forms and talk a little bit about why this is a valuable thing for residents, citizens of Colorado to do. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about optical gas imaging technology as a complementary technology to air quality monitoring processes. So we're going to talk quite a bit about air quality monitoring tonight. We're going to talk about different municipalities, local governments that are thinking of expanding air quality monitoring. And I'm going to make the case that optical gas imaging technology, such as the cameras that I use, are an important component of that because it allows for a direct link to enforcement. So to start, let's talk about oil and gas complaints and informing Colorado's regulatory bodies about issues with facilities. So I'm going to be upfront with you that I've I've worked with a lot of residents who live next to oil and gas facilities who are impacted by oil and gas facilities in their day-to-day lives, whether this is health impacts or other impacts on their livelihood. And these residents have filed complaints and worked through the complaint process with one or both of these agencies. And more often than not, their experience is very disenchanting and disappointing, because the results of this process, of working through this process of informing the state of issues with facilities, are oftentimes not really what people are looking for. They don't lead to a timely and efficient resolution to the issues that may be impacting their lives. And they don't often honestly lead to operators being held truly accountable for harm that they may have caused, which is not a very, I'm painting a pretty negative picture, but there still is value to this process. I mean, this complaint process is not ideal, but it needs to be improved. But one of the ways in which we can work towards improving it is continuing to use the tool that is available to us to inform the state of problematic facilities, and also inform the state of the fact that there are still issues, despite all of the rules and the regulations that we're in the process of implementing, there are still issues that people are facing day to day by living next to oil and gas facilities. And so I've outlined here just a couple of bullets as to why I think it's still valuable for residents to file complaints, even if this process doesn't ultimately always result in the conclusion that we want. There are surely others we can talk about more potentially during the Q&A, but in my mind, some of the main reasons why it still is really valuable for people to use these tools is because on one hand, we can learn more about operations that are going on facilities. Oil and gas operators are not often very transparent and forthcoming, particularly with residents, but they have to share information with the state. And so if there are issues and concerns with the facility, filing a complaint can help you learn more about what may or may not be occurring on that facility. It also does increase scrutiny over facilities, over operators. And this increased scrutiny may not, again, lead to the sort of resolution we're looking for, but it does mean that that operator has to potentially operate under a microscope more than they may have been otherwise. When citizens are filing complaints and are experiencing impacts and letting the state know about those, and the state is investigating, that operator is operating under more scrutiny than they would be otherwise. And then really the most important one, in my opinion, because this is what I do in my role as a watchdog, is we're building a body of evidence here. And honestly, at this point, the state of Colorado, both of these regulatory agencies don't necessarily consider citizen complaints to be evidence. They're more of a prompt that they should investigate. But this is evidence all the same. Your experiences are real and they should matter. And you should let the state know, because we all need to know if facilities are problematic, if people are being impacted, we all need to know that. That needs to be public record. And this is how we push the case that there still is a lot of work to be done in the state of Colorado to deal with the pollution from the oil and gas industry. So I am now going to walk you through both of these complaint forms really quickly, just so you have a sense of what they look like and how to use them if you're in a position where you have to use these forms to inform either of these regulatory bodies about an issue at a facility. So we're going to start with the Department of Public Health and Environment. And I have links on this slide, but I already have both of these pages open. So that link, which will be posted in the chat, will take you here. So this is the landing page for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment's oil and gas health page. There's a lot of information on here. What we're going to focus on today is this link right here that says report a concern. You'll click that, and hopefully this all loads relatively quickly. And it will bring you here. And I should say that so these agencies regulate different components of the oil and gas industry. The Colorado Department of Health and Environment regulates air pollution. And air pollution from oil and gas is typically why people experience health impacts from oil and gas. It's those pollutants that you're breathing in or that you're exposed to that is going to primarily be the cause of health concerns. So if you have a health concern or you smell odors, this is the form that you would use. You would contact and notify the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. At the top of this page, you see a phone number and an email. You can submit complaints or concerns via phone call or email if that was what you'd like to do. But we're going to focus on this online form. So you'll come down here. There are different options you can select in this drop-down menu. You can submit non-health related concerns. You could submit questions, but we're going to focus on the health related concern because, again, if you're using this form, that is probably why you're using the form. You've experienced some impact to your health, or some family members experienced an impact to your health, and you're going to notify the Department of Public Health and Environment. So select that, press next. It'll bring you to this web form. The first thing you'll see is contact information. For this form, you do have to provide your contact information. This is how they follow up with you. Be aware, though, that this is not made public. So none of this contact information will be attached to your complaint. No one will be able to search for your private information, your health information. It's all private. Once you provide that contact information, You select where the exposure that you're concerned about occurred, whether it's at work or home, school, somewhere else. What the source of that potential exposure was, if it's a well site or some other natural gas or oil and gas infrastructure, or if you don't know, you can select other. If the address is at home, if that's where you're experiencing health impacts is at home, you can just keep their contact address. If it's a different address, provide that address. You can provide the site name, which you should be able to find by the signage on the site if it's an oil and gas site. And then you can describe the symptoms. And so the common symptoms, the most common, I should say, symptoms that people experience when they're exposed to oil and gas pollution are things such as headaches, nosebleeds, irritated eyes, irritated throats. But you'll see in this drop-down list that the potential for symptoms that you can report to the state it's a really comprehensive list. It includes a whole host of potential impacts. And my advice to you, because I oftentimes am trying to encourage people to use these forms, and people can maybe be a little bit hesitant because they're afraid of maybe abusing this form, is if you are experiencing something and you think it is connected to an oil and gas facility, express that here. Use this form and inform the state of that. It is not your responsibility to necessarily make that, to prove that connection. You are experiencing something, you have a potential hunch that it has to do with an oil and gas facility, use this form. You're not going to abuse it. You are prompting the state to investigate your concerns. And I should also say too that people experience oil and gas pollution differently. Some people are really not that sensitive necessarily to low levels of exposure, and they may have really, really mild symptoms, but for someone else, that could be a much more severe symptom at that same level of exposure. And so you should just assume that even if your symptoms are relatively mild, that someone else exposed to the same pollution could have much, much more severe symptoms than you. And this is something that should still be elevated to the attention of the Department of Public Health and Environment. So select your symptom. You get to describe a little bit about whether it's a new symptom or it's doctor diagnosed, when it began, how often it occurs. You can add more than one symptom if you are experiencing a host of symptoms. And then you can also discuss whether or not it's something you have consulted your physician about. If that's information you want to share with the Department of Public Health and Environment, you are free to do that. And then finally, you can add additional family members if you and your family are all experiencing symptoms. You can add additional family members, provide their information, and talk about their symptoms here. And then you submit the form, and you will get a follow-up from the Department of Public Health and Environment. They will likely call you and want to discuss your submission. The other form is for the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. So I had another link on that slide. It'll be in the chat. If you follow that link, it takes you here. This is the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission's complaint landing page. Again, there's a lot of information here that you can explore. We're going to focus on this link right here that says file your complaint. And we're going to wait for it to load. All right. So this is the complaint form for the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Be advised that you'll see the first thing you have to do is describe the type of complaint that you are filing. And there is an air quality odor box here. If you select that, this is just going to be forwarded to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, because again, the Department of Public Health and Environment regulates air quality odors. But for all other complaint types, this is the form that you would use. So if you're concerned about noise levels from an oil and gas facility, if there's traffic concerns, if dust or light pollution, or you potentially see something, spills, some actual physical spills into the soil, or some potential issues with dumping, all of those are reasons to fill out this form and notify the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission of what you are noticing and what you're experiencing. So you select the complaint type, select the county where it occurred. You select your connection to the incident. So if you're a nearby resident, if you've just observed something on a facility, and then with this form, you can decide whether or not you want to provide your personal contact information. So you can submit this form anonymously. If you do so, they will not be able to follow up with you about the results of their investigation. So let's assume that you're going to provide your contact information, but again, it is up to you. And if you do that, select that yes, you'll provide your name, your address, email address. You can decide whether or not you want to provide your phone number, and then you can select how you want the COGCC to follow up with you, whether that's through phone, email, or through just physical mail. Once you've done that, you have to describe the location that the concern occurred at, the incident occurred at, and give as detailed of a description as you can of the issue or issues that you've noticed or experienced. You can also indicate whether or not these are ongoing issues or this was a one-time issue. If you know who the oil and gas company is that owns the site, you can select yes here and provide that information in terms of the name, the facility name, the facility number, if you know that information. And again, that's information that should be at most facilities on their signage and easily available. And then finally, you can, with this form, have the option of uploading additional documentation. This would probably take the form of photos, most likely. But if you select that, you're given an option to upload, I think, up to 5 separate files to the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to help this investigation along. Click submit, and you will get follow-up from them regarding an investigation into your complaint. So those are the two primary complaint forms for the two agencies, given the potential impacts that you may be experiencing or noticing from oil and gas development. And we can talk a little bit more about both of those during the Q&A if people have more specific questions about those forms or about the complaint process in general. I'm also more than happy to do one-on-one walkthroughs and conversations with folks if they want to know how to use these forms effectively. My email will be available to everyone for that sort of follow-up. Really quickly, I also want to touch before my time is up here on the second component of what I wanted to talk about tonight, which is how optical gas imaging can play into larger air quality monitoring programs. And again, optical gas imaging cameras are cameras that visualize methane and volatile organic compounds. So they visualize pollution in the form of plumes. Why this is important is because a lot of air quality monitoring systems that use canisters, tests and samples, they're grabbing samples of the air, grabbing samples of a plume, and they're giving us a reading of what is in that plume. So how much benzene, for instance. That's really important information, but what that can't do is it can't tell us exactly where that pollution came from on an oil and gas facility. It can potentially pinpoint a facility, but it can't tell us where that pollution is coming from on the facility. And pollution from oil and gas facilities can occur for a myriad reasons and from a ton of different sorts of equipment. And the best way to pinpoint where pollution may be occurring on a facility is with some sort of visual technology like an OGI camera. So it allows us to document pollution from discrete sources and for maybe start to get a sense of what the reason may be, whether it's a leak or malfunction, or whether maybe an operator is actually not complying with regulations and doing something they're not supposed to be doing. And in this way, OGI is a really complementary technology to any air quality monitoring program because it allows you to directly follow up with some reading that you've detected and potentially inform a repair intervention that can resolve that issue right there, or lead to some enforcement action if it does appear that an operator is potentially violating rules and regulations. So I would encourage you all, as you're lobbying your local governments and municipalities to enhance and increase air quality monitoring, to also consider including optical gas imaging in that kind of suite of technology that you're considering adopting. And I'm going to really quickly just share some visual examples of kind of just to drive this point home. So optical gas imaging technology is a really, really efficient way of determining where there is pollution on a facility. So this is a facility I just filmed last month in Gunnison County outside of Paonia, Colorado. And in this image, there's a separator and a tank on this well pad. There are 3 distinct sources of pollution occurring in this image. We can't see them because they're methane and VOC, so they're invisible to the naked eye, for the most part odorless, probably silent, but they were occurring. And within 10 minutes of an OGI survey, I was able to find 3 distinct sources. So here are 2 separate clips of different sides of that separator. The left-hand side, we have the back side of that separator. And what you see is a line leading into the separator and a leak from that line. That hazy little leak, that's hydrocarbons leaking out of the line. On the right-hand side of the screen is the front of the separator, so what we saw in the image, and there's a door there to access the inside of the separator. And we see a leak coming out from the door. So some component inside is leaking and the hydrocarbons are emerging out from the door. 2 separate leaks, 1 piece of equipment. Was able to find both of these within, again, 10 minutes of looking at this site with a camera. And then finally, the tank also on this facility had emissions coming from the hatch. So this is zoomed in on the hatch at the top of the tank. You can see here in this clip some hydrocarbons coming out from the hatch. It's probably because that hatch is dirty or the seal is broken. The important thing about this is not just that an optical gas imaging camera can quickly identify these issues, it's that all of these are issues that should be relatively easy to resolve. An operator should be able to fix all of these leaks and this pollution relatively easily before it really starts impacting people or the environment, but it has to be discovered first. And the best and most efficient way to discover it is using some sort of visual technology like an optical gas imaging camera. It's not always going to be the case, though, that we can discover things before they impact people. And so when people are filing complaints, one of the most efficient ways of following up to a complaint, particularly if it's a health complaint, is with a camera to determine whether or not there is an ongoing source of pollution that is leading to that complaint. So this is the infamous Krause facility owned by Prospect Energy, Larimer County, north of Fort Collins. I've talked ad nauseum about this facility. I talked about it on the last webinar, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here other than to say that this is a facility where community members were experiencing health impacts, and every time they experienced an odor or health impact, I would investigate with the camera and I would determine whether or not I could see ongoing pollution. And so each time there was an attempted repair and that repair didn't work, I would get notified by the residents who lived nearby that they were still smelling odors. I would look at it with the camera, and within, honestly, a couple of minutes of getting to the site and setting up the camera, I could determine whether or not there was still an ongoing issue. And so this was taken from late last year. That's what this was, a follow-up to a continued complaint of odors, immediate sort of notification that there is still pollution occurring from this tank. And then my last slide, just really quickly, one other thing that's really important, I think, about optical gas imaging technology and the ability to visualize plumes is there's still, and this is one of the reasons that we want more air quality monitoring, is there's still a lot we don't understand about pollution from the oil and gas industry and different sources of pollution, different activities, and how significant the pollution may be from those activities, particularly during the drilling and fracking phase. And so this is a pad, this is an image that I believe I shared on the last webinar of a pad that was drilling in Broomfield. This is the interchange pad. And what we filmed here, and you can see on the left, you don't see any of the evidence of pollution. On the right-hand side, you see this plume of hydrocarbons coming up from around the drilling rig. What we think we filmed here was emissions from the drilling mud and the drill cuttings on the pad. And drilling mud's a little bit of a misnomer. It's not actually mud. It's kind of a chemical concoction that they pump down the well to carry drill cuttings up to the surface so they can be disposed of. It also lubricates the drill and keeps it cool. But what we're seeing here is that drilling mud, that formational mud coming up, probably hot, it's volatilizing. So any hydrocarbons that are being carried along with it in the drill cuttings are volatilizing, off-gassing in the form of a plume, and they're carrying up and away from the site. This is pollution that we still don't really, I mean, this is somewhat outside of regulatory enforcement when it comes to the Air Pollution Control Division, because it still is a kind of a gray area in terms of how significant the pollution from this activity may be. And this is a pad, mind you, that has adopted practices to potentially cut down on pollution from drilling, and we're still seeing pollution like this. And so this is another good use of OGI, and why we need more municipalities, more local governments using OGI, is because we need to understand all of the potential ways in which we still need to strengthen our rules and regulations, because there may be pollution that is slipping through the cracks. So that's all I have to share, but I'll obviously be sticking around for the panel if people have additional questions or concerns or want me to elaborate on anything further.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was super helpful. I know that when I first tried to file a complaint, I felt like it was an impossible task and had to get help. So this is a great resource, and I'm even thinking we should clip part of your presentation and just paste it on our website and direct people to that. So thanks so much. Just want to remind folks that you are welcome to submit your questions for Andrew using the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address those at the end of our presentation. But right now we're going to welcome my good friend Christiane Van Woudenberg with Erie Protectors to talk a little bit about how air quality monitoring works in practice.
Yes, and first of all, thank you so much to Colorado Rising for having me here this evening. We've been working diligently kind of behind the scenes and under the covers to work toward what we hope to be the first kind of comprehensive air quality monitoring mobile application. So just to get started, a little bit about me. Quite a while ago, I got an undergraduate degree from CU Boulder in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology. I did a bunch of graduate work at CU Denver in computational biology and exploratory data analysis. Up until recently, I was a trustee for the town of Erie. And as Sandra mentioned, spent a lot of time and efforts working with Boulder Air and Ajax Analytics to get a comprehensive air quality monitoring program in Erie. And in my day job, I have almost 30 years of experience in enterprise software development. So we've all seen this graphic that we who live on the shale in the DJ Basin here we're inundated with oil and gas infrastructure. So the red dots on this map here show us between kind of Broomfield and Greeley and beyond the extent of oil and gas wells in the basin. Right now, just about 50,000 active wells, another 26,000 plugged in abandoned, and a whole bunch of connecting infrastructure. So the problem that just really became obvious to me as I was a trustee and an impacted resident was really, it's so difficult for a regular person to answer the question, is it safe outside? Is it safe for me to take my children to the park? Is it safe for me to go for a run? Is it safe for me to go for a hike? Those kind of things. And that's not only an issue for those of us that are perfectly healthy, but for those that identify as a member of any sensitive group, whether it be cardiovascular or other respiratory issues. You know, it really is becoming more and more difficult for us to answer that question. And this is an example of a resident in Erie who emailed the Board of Trustees in Erie and was really alarmed by high amounts of VOCs and nitrous oxide readings from the monitoring site near Colliers Hill, and really asking, like, what is it that we can do as residents to actually understand the data that's being presented to us and turn that into actionable information. So for example, in the town of Erie, we now have one high quality monitoring station provided by Boulder Air and another dozen monitoring stations provided by Ajax Analytics. And this is an historical 3-day graph of nitrous oxides and particulate matter for one sensor station over that period of time. And we get to see that there are spikes that sometimes correlate with time of day, sometimes with day of week, but it's really difficult as a layperson to then look at the data here and understand what's actually going on. So for example, in the top middle of your screen here, we see a spike in particulate matter that we don't have much context for. We don't really understand as a layperson, is this something that I should be alarmed about, or is this something that falls within normal levels and is something that could just be because there was an increased amount of truck traffic that went by a dirt road where this sensor happens to be located. So it's very difficult to, for me, having a scientific background, and even more so for the layperson to understand what's going on. The situation is quite a bit better when we look at the data that's provided by Boulder Air. That when you land on the webpage, I captured the screenshot not less than an hour ago, and we understand that, hey, pretty much across the sensor network that Boulder Air is monitoring, we understand that there are higher than normal levels of ozone across the Front Range. And for those of us that identify as being sensitive to ozone, that we might curtail our outdoor activities as a result. The problem is, though, if I'm on my phone and I'm out and about and I want to look at what's happening now, the Boulder Air website on the left and the Ajax Analytics website on the right, they're not really easy to use and they're not designed for a mobile user. So together, myself with Colorado Rising and a quickly expanding network of partners, we're looking at developing a mobile application. And the solution that we're working toward comes in a number of phases. And the first thing that we want to be able to do is to present users with a really simple mobile web application that uses your location and nearby air quality data to just give you a basic indication of air quality, as is currently shown on the Boulder Air website. So red, yellow, green give you a bit of an indication of why it may be in the yellow or red. And that's something that you can just open on your phone, take a look really quick and understand, hey, is it safe for me to go outside, to walk my dog, to take my kid to the park or go on a hike? In the next phase of the application development, what we'd like to do is not only allow users to interrogate when they want to do something, but then to receive push alerts. So for example, with Ajax Analytics, when a certain sensor breaches a certain threshold, let's say it's total VOCs, then that sensor station will trigger the collection of a SUMA air canister. Now, that in itself doesn't indicate specifically that there's an issue with air quality. In the past, we've seen that there's been like issues with the sensors themselves or whatever it may be. But for me as a user, if I want to know that a SUMA canister collection was triggered from an air station near my home, that's information that I can incorporate into my decision-making as to whether I should be outside or not, or to whether I should close the windows. So what we're looking to do is to push along interesting alerts in your area of interest about spikes in volatile organic chemicals measured at air quality stations. Again, those SUMA canister triggers. And for example, if the CDPHE comes out with a regional air quality alert about ozone or what have you, that we could push those to your device as well within the context of a single application. And tying into what Andrew was talking about earlier, that another phase of this application development that we'd really like to do is to guide the layperson through submitting an application. And while Andrew showed us how to log an application or a complaint with the CDPHE and the COGCC, while those two things are necessary, they're not sufficient. And there's a host of other local and regional and state level agencies that may be notified. For example, it's your local municipal government. That Weld County operates an oil and gas department. And depending on whether you make your noise complaint or your odor complaint or your traffic complaint, if there's a nearby site, a facility that's operated by a particular oil and gas operator, well, then it behooves all of us to send that complaint off to the specific oil and gas operator themselves, because they may be in a position to take correction immediately without us having to work through the regulatory agency of submitting a complaint to the COGCC, that complaint being addressed during business hours the next day or two, them forwarding that complaint off to an operator and resulting in somewhere between a 24 to 72 hour response time to the complaint that's made. So in terms of how we want to develop this application, we really want to make sure that it's always going to be free for users to download and use. For me, as a software developer working through agile principles, we want to start small and simple by prioritizing low effort, high reward features for the application. And we want to make sure that we're solving a local problem for those of us that are either directly or disproportionately impacted in the Front Range. But we want to make it useful anywhere that there's data. And we want to make sure that this application is made for and by the community. So in terms of data sources, where can we get data to understand what the air quality is like in our area? As I mentioned earlier, Boulder Air has a small number of very high quality stations throughout the Front Range. Various municipalities like Broomfield and Erie have also contracted with Ajax Analytics to augment that sensor network. The CDPHE operates an additional set of sensors across the state. The city of Denver, in conjunction with local schools, has a program called Love My Air, which operates particulate matter sensors in and around local schools. And then some of us have purchased Purple Air quality monitoring stations and participate in actually a global network of monitoring stations there. And IQ Air also has a large number of fairly low fidelity sensors that are really focused on measuring particulate matter in either the 2.5 or 10 scale. And the intent of what we want to do with our air quality monitoring application, named Viento for the Spanish word for wind, is to aggregate all these data sources and distill that down into something that, again, the layperson can see and understand, and use that information to make decisions about how and when they should conduct outdoor activities and take protective measures. So there is an awful lot of partners that we're looking to work with under the umbrella of Colorado Rising. And that is really about a lot of existing relationships with various municipalities and nonprofits and individuals, and then also working with academic institutions in Colorado to work with BIPOC students to actually use grants and donations to fund the development of this application. Our next steps is that right now we're involved in designing the application. So that's usability engineering and testing for the basic application workflow and features. That through Q3, we want to release a beta version that will be developed by BIPOC university students and initially delivered to those impacted residents that are right by Suncor and the Boulder Air Quality Monitoring Station that's right there, so that those disproportionately impacted residents can take immediate benefits of those notifications and the application. In particular, we'd like to deliver that version of the application in both English and Spanish. Throughout the end of the year, we're really hoping to implement a quality algorithm. Dr. Helmig knows all too well that that is a very difficult problem to address and is going to take some additional collaboration and algorithmic development to incorporate those multiple sensor networks into appropriate and useful air quality alerts. And then hoping by Q1 of 2023 that we can have a really easy to use wizard that will gather complaint information from a user. They can go ahead and snap a photo or a video and to submit that complaint to the appropriate agencies. So that is a really quick introduction into where we'd like to go with this air quality monitoring application. And I'll certainly paste the link to the survey that we've developed and launched today to solicit feedback about folks and their experience with air quality monitoring and what they might want to see out of an application that allows them to understand and take action on issues with air quality in the Front Range area. So that is what I've got for you today, and I'll be happy to talk more about the state of air quality monitoring during the Q&A portion of tonight's session.
Thank you, Christian. We certainly have a few questions for you. I can't tell you how excited I am for this to come to fruition. I think it'll be an invaluable resource. And I encourage you all to continue submitting your questions under the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. for either Christiane or Andrew or one of us. Thanks to those of you who have submitted questions. Up next, and without further delay, we have our favorite attorney, Mike Foote, who will be speaking about legislation and when it comes to air quality monitoring at the state level and locally. So I'll turn the mic over to him.
All right, well, great. Thanks a lot, Sandra. I'm glad that I'm your favorite attorney. And thanks to Christiane for that really awesome presentation on Viento. Really looking forward to seeing that come to fruition. And Andrew, for your very good presentation as usual about the good work you're doing out on the field. And I don't, just so you know, I don't have a PowerPoint, which as it turns out makes it easier to not have to worry about sharing my screen. So I am planning on talking a little bit about air quality monitoring and giving you all maybe a little bit of the scoop about the legislative process and how AQM or air quality monitoring can be improved at the legislative level. And of course, we'll be happy to participate in Q&A as well. So it was mentioned a little bit before, but I was in the legislature for 8 years, 6 years in the House, 2 years in the Senate. I am more than happily retired from elected life at this point. But while I was there, I probably ran 10 bills on oil and gas, maybe a couple others. 8 of the first 9 didn't pass, but you know, I don't think we have to talk about those. But my final one did pass, along with other co-prime sponsors, and that was Senate Bill 181, which, as you know, made a lot of changes to the Oil and Gas Act and the COGCC and local governments. So currently I practice public interest environmental law, which basically in layperson's terms means that I represent people and groups that are working to save the planet, not to destroy it. And but as an attorney, I think that we as attorneys are programmed to just kind of accept what the law is and then try to argue it or bend it to where you want it to be on behalf of your client. But I think a lot of times people don't realize you can actually change the law. And in the legislature in a typical year, we see, say, 500 to 600 bills introduced, maybe 350 of those pass per year. Now, of course, not all of those are earth-shattering types of bills that pass or that are introduced, but some are. Some can make a big difference. And I just throw those numbers out there because I think that sometimes people just don't even really necessarily think about trying to get something passed or to make a change at the legislative level. That's not to say that it's easy, particularly the bigger bills, but it definitely can happen. Senate Bill 181 is a great example. As I said, many of the concepts that ended up passing in 181 were attempted and didn't pass in years prior. And then a lot of things lined up and we were able to pass a pretty decent bill in 2019. But that takes time and effort. And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end of my talk here. But I'll just mention, you know, air quality monitoring, I think we all know it's important. It's part of the solution to protect public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. But right now, my assessment is it's not meeting its potential at the state level. And I would imagine the other 2 presenters probably would agree, and others would agree with that. I think there might be a council member or 2 from Broomfield on this call, and they might talk about this more, but Broomfield is a pretty good example of having a robust air quality monitoring system that actually is detecting or has detected spikes in bad stuff coming out of these facilities. And the state really hasn't done anything about it. So you can have a really good AQM system, but then the next part of the equation is that there needs to be good enforcement. And right now, I think we have seen the state not really doing a good job of doing that. So we can change that, I think. But I also think that it probably would take some legislative action in order to do that. I think it's important to recognize, first of all, that the Air Pollution Control Division within the CDPHE and the COGCC are large bureaucracies. And large bureaucracies, whether it be government or large corporations, are typically, the people within those are typically quite careful and risk averse. there's not really a reward often for sticking your neck out and going the extra mile, but there's definitely disincentives for doing that and being wrong. So I think you kind of have to maybe recognize that a little bit when thinking about legislation or other things to change the unsatisfactory results that we're getting at this point in time. Now, that's not to say that local air quality monitoring is not important. I think it's already been outlined that it is important, and not the least of which is that if there was not local air quality monitoring, the only air quality monitoring that we would really have in any kind of force would be that's employed by the industry. And that's not going to work, or it shouldn't work, because as we all know, it may not be all that reliable, or the reporting may not be all that reliable. One example I think I'll give you very quickly is there is a comprehensive area plan in front of the COGCC. It's 20 some odd facilities. I think it's just 20 facilities, which could be up to 150 wells planned in Aurora. It's called the Box Elder Cap. Now, within the comprehensive area plan, the operator that submitted the application talks about how they've done their own air quality monitoring, and based on their experience, they don't think that the 151 wells are going to cause any problems for people. So, that might be a little bit laughable on its surface, but then you look at the rest of the application and it goes on to say that they project, despite thinking that it's not going to really harm people, they project that over the first 10 years of all of the facilities that they're going to produce over 2,300 tons of NOx, over 1,500 tons of VOCs, and over 1 million tons of carbon, CO2. So I guess all this is to say is that there's a lot of bad stuff that still is going to be coming out of these facilities, even if the air quality monitoring done by the industry supposedly says that it's not going to be that harmful. So there are, getting into maybe a little bit more of some legislative suggestions. Certainly I'll make a couple here. I do think that there's at least one legislator on this call. And I'll make a couple of suggestions. I'm sure there's other suggestions that are out there and that are viable. And then talk a little bit about the process after that. Now, first, I kind of do want to acknowledge that over the last couple of years, there has been some progress on air quality, and there have been a number of good bills that have passed the legislature. I think, as we all know, there's more work that can be done and should be done. Andrew, when he gave his first presentation, or when he gave his presentation first, spoke about some of the difficulties that are encountered by his group and other citizen complaints. I think that's very real, and these complaints are made even with this high quality OGI and camera operator that knows what he's doing. And then the state doesn't really do much about it because it didn't come from a state employee. And so it's almost like groups like Earthworks or other citizens just don't really have that much of a standing, if any at all, within these state agencies. And that's not right. And that could be changed, actually, I think, through legislation. If it's not going to be changed otherwise, there could be bills passed that would give citizens and citizen groups standing in order to bring these things and to be taken seriously. And I think that would be something that would be valuable and should be considered. Another thing that folks could consider would be putting in a version of the precautionary principle when it comes to these types of alleged violations. You can, in other words, you can play around with the burden of proof. I mean, right now, the way that it works is that of course, the state has the burden of proof, and then the industry can come in and nitpick and say why they think they're wrong. But the question, I think, that goes back to maybe what Christian had said before is that, is it really safe? I mean, you can nitpick what was reported, but is it really safe? And that's what the precautionary principle is all about, is to say, yes, it is safe, or at least perhaps the industry should prove that what they're doing is safe. And that also could be something that could be submitted or discussed through legislation. Now, when I say these, I'm not at all implying that this would be an easy thing to do. So don't get me wrong there, but these are ideas that people could chew on. So there was, over the last couple of years, particularly this last session, the Air Pollution Control Division was given a lot of new personnel. And I don't think there's been any debate that they have not had enough people to do what they need to do. I think they ended up having maybe 50 new full-time equivalent employees or so as a result, which is a lot. But you also could kind of give them a plan and a tighter statutory mission to monitor and do random audits of the industry, for example, or the industry's air quality monitoring. Just suggesting it and not having it in statute means that the bureaucracies can easily get around it. And they still may be able to get around it if it's in statute, but it's a lot harder to do so. One thing I was thinking also about off and on over quite some time, and what Christian talked about in his presentation brought this to the forefront of my mind again, is there really could be, and there's models for this within the state, there could be a community interface type of position or positions within these particular agencies. Those that are responsible for interacting with the community and even advocating on behalf of those in the community. The model is, well, it wouldn't be exactly like this, but within the Public Utilities Commission, there's an Office of Consumer Advocate who their job, their statutory duty is to advocate for consumers in front of the Public Utilities Commission. There's nothing like that within the CDPHE. There's nothing like that within the COGCC. So there could be something like that that could come about. So there's other good ideas out there too, and maybe we'll hear about some of those in Q&A. But none of those would happen without persistence and perhaps even multiple shots at it. So I just kind of want to make that clear. It doesn't just happen at the legislative level. People may come up with really good ideas, and they may bring in the legislators, say in March, and that's just not going to cut it because of the schedule and because of everything that's going on at the legislature. It requires in my opinion, it requires a steady presence at the Capitol, putting in a lot of work, having relationships with legislators in order to make sure that it gets a solid hearing and good consideration. I'll give you a very quick overview of what their schedule looks like so that you kind of know when it would be best time to plug in. I'll just start at the beginning of the year. January, February, the legislature starts usually like around January, say 8th or 9th. The first couple of months of the session are fairly chill. And people are kind of like, oh, this is, not that big of a deal. We should be pretty fine this year. It won't be that hard. That's always wrong. By the time March rolls around, there's all kinds of bills and issues and stuff that came up that you weren't anticipating. And all of a sudden you're feeling pretty crushed. April and May is more just about survival and passing the majority of the bills that you always felt like you should have introduced and considered earlier in the session. And the session usually ends around May 5th, 6th, or something like that. It's 120 days of session. June, the end of May through June is typically when legislators just want to kind of turn off their computer and go on vacation because they're so burnt out from the last couple of months. But then usually around July or so is when legislators are typically thinking about the next session, assuming that they're coming back, or assuming if they're in a competitive seat that they don't have to just completely focus on getting reelected. So, if you're interested in putting forth ideas about the next legislative session, July would be a really good time to try to get that going. August is the same thing. Although, the election years make it more complicated because obviously people are out trying to get the right people elected or getting themselves reelected. But for those that are not necessarily as in competitive races, they're still helping others, but they're starting to really refine their legislative agenda, starting really September, October, and November. And then once the election occurs, then it's a lot of work to really put it down on paper and get bills drafted and so forth. So December is all about that when they're not busy with the holidays. And so all of this is just to say, again, keep that in mind when you are approaching legislators or you have ideas about air quality monitoring or anything else. Like I said, the first approach in the middle of March, it may be an awesome idea, but it's just going to be 99% sure not to happen because of the dynamics of the session and the work that the legislators have to do. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there because people don't necessarily realize that. So I think I'm going to stop there because I might have gone over my 15 minutes already. And of course, you know, happy to take Q&A and talk about anything further if anybody has any questions. But thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much, Mike. You are perfectly on time. I know that I often forget about the legislative side of things as I just kind of plow along trying to organize the community. So your update is always helpful. We're going to begin our Q&A portions shortly. So please feel free to submit your questions. If you can't figure out the question and answer box for some reason, feel free to submit them in the chat and we'll grab them from there too. Let me see, Logan, can you help me share the next couple, the next screen? Thank you. So as we begin this portion of our discussion tonight, I'm going to ask all of our panelists here to briefly introduce themselves. And I'll start and kind of pass on to the next person. I'm Sandra Dugan. I'm with Colorado Rising, and I'm helping to facilitate today's question and answer panel. Kate.
Hi everyone, I'm Kate Brown with Colorado Rising, and I am also helping facilitate the Q&A. I'll hand it over to Andrew.
Hello again, everyone. Andrew Closter, Colorado Field Advocate with Earthworks, and I will pass to Christian.
Christian Van Woudenberg, Chief Editor of the Erie Protectors. I'll pass it off to Ed.
Ed Bean, I'm Media Liaison with the Larimer Alliance. Thank y'all. I'm not sure who I'm passing off to. I think I'll pass off to Mike Foote.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Mike Foote, environmental attorney. And I will pass it off. Oh my gosh. I'll pass it off to Lori Anderson. How about that?
Hi, I'm Lori Anderson, a council member for the city and county of Broomfield. And I will pass it to Dr. Helmig.
Yes, hi everybody. Detlef Helmig. I'm overseeing this monitoring network here in the Front Range that's run by Boulder Air and sponsored by different municipalities across the Front Range. Good to be here.
And John.
Hi, I'm John McDonough, retired environmental attorney, working with the Larimer Alliance. Good to be here.
And Logan.
Hi, I'm Logan Tyler, and I'm the Digital Media Coordinator with Colorado Rising.
Thanks so much, everyone. We're going to start with
I saw Jody raising her hand, by the way, so just wanted to acknowledge her.
Yeah, we're trying to get a Jody on the panel. We'll hopefully get her in as soon as possible, but I want to start with just kind of a logistical question someone asked is what will be the best way to share this webinar? We are recording right now and we'll be sharing it with all of the participants here tonight. You should get a link in your email, and then we should have it up on YouTube too, correct, Logan? So we'll have that up on YouTube too, if that's an easier way for you to share it. I know my husband is currently watching the Avalanche game. He wanted to join us, but it's the Stanley Cup. So we'll make sure to share this so that folks who couldn't be here tonight can access it. The first question I'm going to throw out will probably be best addressed by Mike Foote, but somebody asked how it's possible that we need evidence when other countries and US states have outlawed fracking altogether. Can you speak a little bit about why banning fracking has been hard in the state of Colorado and why states like New York are able to do it when we haven't?
Yes, I can talk about that a little bit. So first of all, I'm somewhat familiar with New York and their process because of the compendium that is updated at least once a year that comes out that does put together a great deal of evidence about the dangers of fracking and oil and gas drilling. And so, you know, they do in that compendium, I think, have a lot of evidence, some stronger than others. But you know, when you take a look at it all, it clearly points to, in my opinion, clearly points to the direction that that's harmful for people, particularly as they're closer to residences. That's not to mention it's harmful for the climate, of course, but the compendium really focuses on health and safety dangers. And New York really took that into consideration when it made that decision. I mean, the political dynamics in New York were and are much different than those here in Colorado. I mean, I think that's the easiest way to explain it. The oil and gas industry here is much bigger and much more powerful, and they get their way quite a bit. Even over the last couple of years, they still have been able to drill, and they still get permits. Not all the time, but they still do. So I never really considered a statewide fracking ban to be within the realm of possibility in the legislature because of those dynamics. But as time goes on, perhaps it will be, and it wouldn't be really my decision to be made anyway, since I'm not a legislator anymore. But that's how it would end up being passed, or through a ballot measure. But again, I just think New York and Colorado are much different when it comes to that particular area.
Thanks, Mike. I know I wish we could outlaw it altogether. The next question we have is for Andrew. Somebody asked if the FIR cameras are thermal images, do the apparent vapors observed from a facility definitely contain VOCs/methane, or could the images be indicative of heat plumes or steam instead?
So yeah, OGI cameras, optical gas imaging cameras, are IR cameras. They're infrared cameras, but they're specially designed infrared cameras. They have a filter on board that filters out most of the IR spectrum and focuses right in on where hydrocarbons, so methane and volatile organic compounds, are absorbing infrared radiation. And so, yes, they can detect steam and heat, but steam and heat look very different in an OGI footage than hydrocarbons do. And part of the reason that all of us on staff who use OGI cameras at Earthworks get trained and certified to use these cameras and go through the same training and certification that the industry does and that regulators at CDPHE and COGCC do is to be able to determine what the difference is between a plume of hydrocarbons and a plume of steam. They look very different on the camera. It's something that you are trained to differentiate between.
Thank you. This is kind of a question I'm throwing out for anybody. Is there any real air quality improvement in sight? I don't want to leave, but I'm afraid that it's my only option. Anybody want to take that on?
Oh, sure, Sandra, I'll add something.
Lori.
So I would not say, I wouldn't go with insight, like really super close, but I would say that we are making incredible progress as we're gaining more and more data from Dr. Helmig, and also we have the AJAX analytics program, and we continue to get more air quality data. We've brought that before the CDPHE. They did know there's a limitation there because we don't have those air toxic standards set under the Clean Air Act. But with the passage of HB 22-1244 this year, the air toxics bill, that one actually requires the state to set air toxics data for some of the top air toxics. One of them is benzene. And benzene, as Mike Foote noted, that Broomfield has been seeing spikes, a spike of up to 224 parts per billion of benzene, and others that are very high. It's sustained for the average 1 hour estimate for the ATSDR standard for the acute health guideline. seeing 224 parts per billion in those canisters, and then other numbers up there. And the limit is set at 9 parts per billion. So we have some evidence that these the benzene is very high. There's other chemicals we need to look at. It's under HB 1244 and the data we're collecting, which is why we need to enhance this network and continue to grow. We've got Broomfield, Erie, Boulder, Longmont, now down into Denver with the Cultivando program, monitoring the Suncor refinery. And all of that data, along with legislative changes, we are going to see change. We are going to see something happen. So yes, but it's still, it's not here today yet. We're still progressing towards that point.
Also, if I can add something to that, thanks, Laurie. The answer to the question ties into the scale. What's where are you looking? What are you looking for? We have now 7 or 8 of these monitoring sites in the front range, and each of them reports different data and different trends and different pollutants that are more concerning than others. So you cannot really give a simple answer, yes or no. And it's really diverse. It really depends on where you are and what the activities are in the immediate surrounding that mostly impact that particular monitoring station. There are only a few pollutants where I would say we see a large scale general trend. Air improvements, air quality improvements inside. We do see a pretty clear signal that nitrogen oxides have been steadily declining during the COVID years. It went down very significantly because not that many people were out there driving cars and trucks and so forth. We're not going to see what's going to happen now where we're making it back out of the COVID shutdowns. But generally speaking, nitrogen oxides have come down for quite a while. That should bring ozone levels down, since ozone is largely driven by emissions of nitrogen oxides and VOCs, but we have not seen a clear response in ozone to these declines of nitrogen oxide. So it's complicated, it's diverse. For some of the organic compounds, we see new high levels, unexpected high levels, high frequency of spikes. We just had a call today where we observed hydrocarbons at one of the Broomfield sites that just raised our eyebrows. They were not there 3 months ago. Why is that now all of a sudden? And we've seen this over and over, that out of the blue, we see an uptick in pollutants that shouldn't be there. There's stricter regulations that's been passed in the last few years. But if you look at the data of some of the sites, we don't see the signatures of the legislation clearly. We actually see at some of the sites just the opposite, where we see an uptick in pollutant plumes, the frequency and the heights of the spikes. So you got to be very, very careful. You got to specify which pollutants are you talking about and for which particular site and environment, and what are the activities surrounding that particular site.
I would just add a couple things. First of all, I have no idea if it's going to happen, but I do know that there are a number of folks and organizations that are working to make it happen, and I hope that they're successful. When you look at funding that has come down over the last couple of years for things like electric vehicle infrastructure, converting school buses, and legislation that's come down over the last couple of years, there's a group of folks in the state government that are that have this at close to the top, if not the top of their priority list, which is encouraging. A lot better than it being the other way around, like we see in some states where they actively try not to do these types of things. And there's administrative actions like in the Public Utilities Commission and Excel and Black Hills and Tri-State having to submit their plans for reducing fossil fuel use, and those are making progress. And so I want to strike a cautiously optimistic tone because there are folks that are working on the issue and they're working hard, and it's an important issue. Of course, the proof will be in the pudding. And the one thing that that does concern me, though, is that you have agencies like the Public Utilities Commission or the Air Quality Control Commission doing one thing, and then you have agencies like the COGCC that are potentially granting permits to drill another 200 or more new wells that are going to emit. And so, you know, the left hand and the right hand don't necessarily seem to be aligned when it comes to that. So, but I do like the fact that there are a number of people that want to continue to go in the right direction, and that's good.
Sandra, if I could, let me just add a little bit longer perspective to this. You know, I've been working these issues since I got out of law school in 1982. And I can tell you, there have been so many issues analogous to this. In the early days, it was rampant hazardous waste disposal, hazardous substance mismanagement, early regulations of air toxics, the absence of the most minimal water quality protections prior to the NPDES permitting system. When we were in the midst of those issues, they all could look hopeless. And it always seemed as though we often had the folks with the money and the power on the other side. But you know what? There has been considerable progress on all those issues. They take time and they take a resolve on our part to keep fighting. We may not have the money, but we have time on our side, and that's a powerful force. We will, you know, older folks like Ed and I will work these issues, and the folks coming behind us like Mike will work these issues. And then younger folks like Caitlin and Sandra will work these issues, and we will keep on pressing. So to go back to the questioner's original point, I would say don't give up, keep on fighting, because yes, the arc bends slowly, but we do bend it. And it does bend toward environmental protection. So I'd say hang in there, keep fighting the good fight. If not in my life, then in the life of some of you all.
Thanks so much, John. That made me feel better. I want to ask a couple of the questions that were addressed in the chat already, but I figure maybe some folks want to know those answers. So somebody asked Christiane on a timeline when it comes to when we'll be able to access the app. And I know he covered it a little bit in his PowerPoint presentation, but I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit too.
Yes, we hope to have a beta version of the app in Q3.
That's soon, folks. And then another person asked about, this is for Mr. Detlev and also Christiane and anyone else that wants to jump in, but asked about obtaining kind of at-home air quality monitoring and whether or not that would be beneficial.
So not like a whole bunch of residents in and around Erie, as the May J and Papa Joe sites came online, ordered sensors from Purple Air or IQ Air. And they are just slightly better than useless in terms of their fidelity and their sensitivity and the accuracy of the data that they gather. So you'll get some very basic indication of particulate matter, but that's about it. So it offers some benefit, but doesn't even enter the realm of the data and the equipment that is gathered and analyzed by Boulder Air. The amount of equipment and the science that goes into not only collecting, but then analyzing that data is well beyond the capabilities of any individual.
And I'll just add, when I was, well, I'm still kind of suffering through the impacts of the megapad near my home. I was temporarily accessing a neighbor's Purple Air app that had methane add-ons, so to speak, that they were using at the time. And I didn't find it to be very reliable or in keeping with what I was feeling and seeing outside. now that I have access to Boulder Air's data, and I can check that before going on walks, et cetera, I feel a little bit more in the know about what exactly is in the air outside. So from a consumer perspective, it might give you some peace of mind to have, at-home air quality monitoring, but it's definitely not as effective. Dr. Detlev?
Yes. And I've been asked that question so many times. And I've been contacted by so many citizens who, with that question, or because they acquired some of these air sensors and they are getting some reading signals and they're concerned and ask me for help. My opinion agrees 90% with Christian's, but I would take it a step further. And let's just say I think they cause more harm than good. From my experience and my evaluation of these sensors, they're just not suitable to measure pollutants at ambient levels to a degree that the data are really meaningful, helpful, valid, and the odds that they give false reading, alarming readings, misleading readings are pretty high, and it so it has the risk to cause a lot of concern with people who use them. Seen it so many times. They want to take their children out of the house and move away, go into the mountains because one of these little sensors had a yellow, orange, or red alarm. And I would say there's probably 80, 90, 95% chance this was a false alarm, or it was detecting something else that's totally different because the sensors are not selective enough and they're not sensitive enough. So I would recommend against it.
A follow-up question coming from yours truly. How about air quality filtering devices from our homes, some which have marketing as VOC filtering? Can we feel like those are to any help to us who are, having to be in a position where we're close to oil and gas?
That's a tough one. Generally speaking, for many pollutants, outdoor air is actually cleaner than indoor air. There was just a paper published, I saw again, showing that especially homes that utilize natural gas for water heater in the basement, gas for the stove for cooking, those things leak. The burning of gas in your house causes carbon monoxide, which is a real bad gas to have there. Other things in your household, cleaning supplies, lots of things we use in our households outgas pollutants. And indoor air quality standard research has been done for 30, 40 years, and most of the work shows that most times air outside is cleaner than inside. So it's better to open up your windows and provide good ventilation. Now, if you live right next to an oil and gas site and they're renting something, it may change things a little bit. And for one of the biggest concerning pollutants we have here, ozone, it is the opposite. That ozone is higher outside and gets destroyed as it infiltrates into your home, and ozone levels inside the home are definitely smaller than outside the home. So if you're concerned about ozone, if you have high ozone conditions, I would say, yeah, keep your windows closed, stay inside. And then these filters, you've got to do your research. There's different types. Filters, actually, I'd be somewhat skeptical because filters saturate, and then, it's like your vacuum cleaner. Once it's full, the bag is full. It doesn't vacuum much anymore. And these filters, you got to watch them and know when they're saturated. And many of these don't tell you. So you may hear a fan running. Air goes somewhere, it comes out, goes in, and it comes out at the other end, as dirty as it goes in. There's some other devices that have that actually oxidize and chemically destroy the pollutants through catalytic converters. They need a lot of energy, so also bear in mind, you've got something that it uses up a lot of energy, and for of energy. Somebody has to go out fracking and generate more gas or oil and to produce the electricity, so it's brought to your house. So yeah, you're going to do something that's good for your home, but you're doing something bad on another end. So there's I've seen just some very recent studies that showed that good air purifiers, if they're new and well maintained, can provide an improvement in VOCs in an indoor environment. So I'm sorry, this is not a simple generic answer. Unfortunately, I'd rather give you a simple answer, but you've got to do your homework, read some consumer reports, and choose the right model and apply it during the conditions where it's really most needed. And many times it might just be better just open the windows and provide good ventilation.
Thank you. We are in the process of replacing our gas stove now, so I feel validated at the investment that's going to be for us. A couple of other questions. One that was submitted to me privately, so you might not see it on the chat, was about how we can pass air quality monitoring or how we can get air quality monitoring established in a new location such as Larimer County or Fort Collins. And luckily we have two folks on our panel today who have been through the air quality monitoring implementation process that can help us kind of address how that went in your town. So Lori or Christiane, if you could help me answer that question, I would appreciate it.
Sure. So Boulder was a first location in the Front Range that actually had the Boulder air stations. And Broomfield, it was a long, slow process. So anyone going forward with air quality monitoring following on the heels of Broomfield and then Erie and Longmont and now the monitoring down in Denver can base their monitoring. They don't have to go through that same process that we went through. They can look to see what we're doing now, which we have excellent systems running and we have refined it. So the long, slow process in the beginning does not have to occur again. I mean, just simply, I know Broomfield's receptive to it. I think each of these communities is receptive to the staff reaching out to them and learning, how to jump in right away. The biggest obstacle is establishing the need, and the cost is high. This is monitoring is not cheap. When Broomfield approved the operator agreement back in 2017 with Extraction Oil and Gas, they agreed to $20,000 a year for the cost to cover air quality monitoring. It's $1 million a year to get the type of air quality monitoring that's high enough for the quality that you can actually trust the data. And that's just the reality of it. It is not a cheap process. But when we look at the health and safety of our communities and not understanding what's in the air, I mean, we could take all these pieces. We have the FLIR camera data, we have Broomfield's health survey and the state's, studies. We know there's health impacts and we have to understand what's in the air. It's that critical. So I think it's trying to bring forward that health and understanding the health of the community is so important. And then looking to the communities that have already done this process and just and there's a lead time associated with it. You have to get going.
Oh, I think we might be losing Lori there.
On it sooner than later.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I know it's not a simple process to outline. I know that my experience in Erie was that there was a lot of community outreach and push to our board to try and get air quality monitoring implemented in light of a big oil and gas production that we were all kind of suffering the ramifications for. So that and having a couple of allies on our board that were willing to listen got kind of the issue on the agenda, so to speak. And from there, we moved on to getting a proposal from Dr. Helmig and HRAX Analytics. And Gratefully, or I'm grateful that it did pass in my community. So we do have that air quality monitoring in place now. And that's a little bit of that. I know, Dr. Helmig, I've heard you speak enough times now to know that every additional point that we add to the whole, picture by adding a new air quality monitoring station helps us. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, we never anticipated that this would develop the way or along the path it's been taken. And this is new, this is novel, you don't find this anywhere else in the country. A network of air monitoring stations supported by local communities, monitoring this many different species in real time, continuous, which really has provided us a whole lot of new insight we didn't even anticipate. And then having the ability to compare monitoring data from these different locations has enabled us to pinpoint certain emission regions, emission sources. Just this morning, we said, hey, in Brookfield, there you have something within that square mile that's releasing some natural gas, where nobody else had suspected it, but by having multiple stations, you can really narrow this down. It has allowed us to show, what's background, what's moving into the region from outside, and where levels, which pollutants are produced locally. Also, we're learning a lot more about exposure and how do you assess exposure. A lot of the pollutants we're observing here, we're identifying, occur in very short squirts and spikes that only last 10, 20, 30 minutes, and then they come down again. Because air is dynamic, it moves around all the time, and you have a pollution source, it may carry that pollution somewhere downwind, but it may only hit it for a fraction, and as the air swivels around, you may not see it again 30 minutes later. But a lot of the exposure is determined by these spikes, where levels goes ways up. We've seen changes by a factor of 1,000 times within 10 minutes, from a value of 1 to a value of 1,000, and then it drops again 10 minutes later. And unless you do this monitoring, what we call it continuous and high time resolution. So high time resolution means you measure and measure and measure and measure every minute. So you get a data point every minute, so you can see it go up and came down. So unless you do it like that, you don't see it. You wouldn't identify it, because old-fashioned traditional monitoring was often configured that you average over longer time periods, and you may see a value that's just 5–10% higher than what you anticipated, and that often is within the analytical uncertainty of the measurement, so you don't even pay attention. It doesn't matter. But now we can show, well, it actually went up by a factor of 1,000 over 10 minutes. The weekly average will still only be 5–10% different, but it went up by a factor of 1,000. And if somebody had been in that plume, exposed to it, it really mattered. So by doing this continuous high time resolution monitoring, wherever we can, anything we can measure high time resolution, we will do. We've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about the nature of the pollutant. We are able to pinpoint it, tell where it's coming from, because we correlate it every minute with the winds, and we see winds came from there, it went high again. Oh, it came down, winds came from the other side, and oh, it went up again. Oh yeah, winds came from there, sure enough. So by doing this over and over and over, we can apply statistical tools that allow us to identify where some of these pollutants originate from. When we started that 5 years ago, a lot of this we didn't know, we didn't anticipate. And so as we've moved forward with this, also with the help of the community partners who've been watching this, we've learned a lot. We're so much smarter now than we were 5 years ago. And I promise you, if we keep this going for another 5 years, we'll be even way more smarter than we are now.
Thank you. This is kind of a related question, although it might be best addressed by Andrew or Mike. Is it true that the CDPHE and APCD don't even recognize or use as evidence Boulder Air's AQ monitoring data and results? If not, why not? Because it's the state of the art in air quality monitoring.
I can start, Mike, and then if you want to fill in any gaps that I miss. I mean, I think Mike mentioned this in his brief talk. The state, both the COGCC and the APCD don't really recognize any evidence that their staff do not collect themselves. So that includes air quality monitoring data. It also includes the OGI videos that I take. It includes citizen complaints. When citizens file complaints, when they claim that they have experienced something, a health impact, that is not considered actual evidence of a health impact. That's considered a prompt that the state should investigate. But none of this evidence that we all submit, that we all gather independently of the state, is considered evidence by the state right now. And as Mike talked, and I mean, can maybe talk a little bit more, that's something that would be, I think is imperative that we correct and that we fix, because there's a lot of data that's being collected, and there's more and more data that's being collected that isn't being collected by state staff, and we can help bolster their efforts because they are capacity constrained. And so all of these efforts, from air quality monitoring to the OGI that I do to the complaints that citizens file, is a means of providing more oversight of this industry, and that should be considered more seriously. That was one of the intents of SB 181, is that burden of proof would shift and that citizens would be taken seriously. So that is unfortunately the case right now, but it's something that we really need to look to change. And I don't know if Mike has anything he'd like to add.
I think Andrew covered it very well. I mean, I think it's pretty absurd, frankly. I mean, just look at common experience. If somebody calls in and reports a crime has occurred, police officer shows up and takes the report, but they don't decline to prosecute the crime just because the police officer didn't see it. And that's kind of what we see at the state level with air quality types of violations. Now, I mean, there's been discussion here about some monitors being very unreliable and the instruments being unreliable. So that's, we get that, understandable. But for the state to basically insist, which it seems like to me they are, and Andrew's talking about at least his interactions, they've been that way, for the state to insist that they actually have to see it in order to pursue it, I think is way too parochial, and it's not appropriate. But, in order to change it, you probably would need to have some kind of legislation to do it, because it seems to be pretty ingrained.
Can I just add that when we were going through the process for HB 1244, the air toxics bill, we actually were, this is one of the pieces I really heavily weighed in on, was the community-led monitoring programs, and getting language in there that was open enough. And this is not for the FLIR camera, but just for the AQM, that we actually came with the language of community groups monitoring that is at least as stringent as the second edition of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency's compendium methods for the toxic organic compounds in ambient air. That was to try to get to the point that the Boulder air data would be accepted. And I believe that they accomplished that goal. And then that data is accepted during the rulemaking process, specifically for this, for determining those air toxic contaminants. But that language maybe it needs to be refined just a bit more if we're not quite there yet, and then carried into the CDPHE. So there is progress on accepting that all this data that we're collecting. It would be a shame for the state not to address this and take our data.
Thanks,
I can
Lori.
add that the equipment that Andrew takes with him is often far better than what the COGCC has for their field inspectors, especially when you talk about the kind of lenses that attach to these FLIR cameras. And another point that would be really, really helpful is if we could, and it's, deputizing isn't the right word, but in terms of giving the weight of testimony provided with a FLIR camera of a municipal employee. So let's say the town of Erie purchases a FLIR camera and trains a thermographer and sends them out to investigate a complaint, that I think there's an opportunity legislatively to give that testimony of that video footage equal weight as a field inspector from the COGCC.
Yes, thank you. I think it's important to note that the COGCC just recently changed its mission statement from fostering oil and gas production to allegedly protecting health, safety, and the environment. So these are changes that are coming our way very slowly and too slowly, in most of our opinion. And so we need to push them in that direction in any way we can. A couple of related questions I think will be best addressed by Mike, but anyone feel free to jump in. Can you talk a little bit about why SB 181 allowed each county to pass regs that could exceed the state standards, including enforcement?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the premise, it comes down to local control, and the premise is that the state would be the floor, and the state would need to pass protective regulations, but also that localities could go above and beyond. We certainly didn't want localities to be able to go below the state's floor, even though Weld County has tried to do that. But we wanted to make sure that there's some localities like, say, Broomfield or Larimer County or others could go above and beyond what the state's doing, because they think that their residents deserve to have even more protections. And that was the main point, and that you know, was pretty clear, I think, in the legislation.
I might ask a specific question, Mike. Is that supposed to apply to existing facilities as well as any new permits that may be in the pipeline?
Yeah. I mean, as regulated industries, and there's case law that supports this, and it's also just, I guess, common sense. I mean, regulated industries know that there could be new rules coming down to further regulate the industry. You know, I mean, if somebody puts a well in 1995 and there's found to need to be more protections for that particular well, it's still going to apply even though they put it in 1995. So it's pretty clear that it should and could apply to wells. The COGCC itself and its rulemakings is specific about which ones would apply retroactively and which ones wouldn't. And there's recognition, widespread, in that safety regulations could be applied retroactively.
You know, Mike, this is my understanding and the understanding of other counsel that I've spoken with, but please correct me here if I'm wrong. But following on in your point there, the authority that's granted under SB 19181, particularly as that's then codified in the Local Government Land Use Control Enabling Act. As I understand it, basically set local governments up pretty much as independent and co-equal regulatory, you know, kind of gave them an independent and co-equal status with the COGCC. So, you know, it's not really unfair to look and say, hey, these are the things the COGCC is doing. These are the things that could be done at the county or city level. One does not bar the other, one does not preclude the other. Indeed, they were sort of independent and co-equal after the passage of 19181. Is that a fairly accurate interpretation in your view?
Yes, as applied to surface impacts. When it comes to downhole and regulating the fracking process downhole, that's COGCC jurisdiction. But surface impacts, locating new oil and gas facilities or surface impacts of existing facilities, local government should have the same kind of authority to implement regulations and enforce as the COGCC does.
So basically, if it's not a downhole activity per se, you know, establishing the case, setting the casing, or whatever other activity is going down, if it's a surface or above surface impact, SB 19181 basically sets localities up in a similar regulatory authority capacity as the state agencies.
Yes, they have that authority. Some choose to use it, some don't.
So another question that's kind of related. There is some confusion as to what agency is supposed to address that. I think I would say great confusion. If counties don't enforce them, the state does, but enforcement is elusive. Please talk about this a little bit more. And then could all of these be addressed by a separate cleanup bill that would clarify these issues?
Well, I can say, Sandra, that at least this has been a particular challenge for us here in Larimer County, because as you know, the Larimer County Board of County Commissioners with great fanfare adopted, not even a year ago, they adopted in July of 2021 and made effective September 15th of 2021, a very detailed regulatory framework that applied to new and existing facilities. And indeed, they used that phrase, new and existing oil and gas facilities, over 24 times. The challenge has been that more recently, particularly as these challenges, these problems, these well-documented violations at the Krause facilities came to light, the county came under public pressure to enforce those regulations. And they have in the regs very specific enforcement provisions that very specifically, by their own language, apply to new and existing facilities. For some reason which we don't understand, the county has chosen not to interpret those regulations despite the new and existing language, which is replete within them, has chosen not to apply those to facilities that pre-existed the September 15th, 2021 effective date of the regulations. And since they don't apply to new and existing, or since they don't apply to pre-existing facilities, according to the county's interpretation, and since there are no new facilities, the regulations basically become a dead letter in terms of enforcement. We've asked repeatedly for an explanation as to why this is the case. Now, why do we need the explanation? For exactly the point you mentioned. We can't do cleanup legislation if we don't understand the perceived problem. We've been through those regulations with a fine-tooth comb. We don't see the problem. We don't see it with either Article 11's language or the SB 19-181 language that Mike has discussed. So we've asked, okay, maybe we're missing something. Where is it? We need to know that so that we can work with the county to either persuade them that they do have the authority, or if we're wrong and they don't, then to work with them constructively to figure out where those deficiencies are and rectify them either through state or local regulatory statutory changes. Unfortunately, despite numerous requests, we've been unable to get even a simple explanation for why those regulations, which again use new and existing couple dozen plus times, don't apply to existing facilities, hence don't apply to any facilities in Larimer County. So this is one of those battles where the public interest is so important here that we can't afford to walk away. I know we sound a bit like a broken record on this, but you know, you've heard from Andrew, you've heard previously in our webinar from Dr. Corey Carroll, we've heard from Detlef, why this is so important. We can't afford to just walk away. So folks, we need your help and we need your engagement on these issues.
Thank you. And with that, I'll get to our last question here. This one is for Dr. Helmig. And it's regards to continuous sampling or monitoring that the systems perform, Boulder Air Systems perform. Are you able to attribute or associate VOCs and hydrocarbon air pollution to certain sources like oil and gas versus motor vehicles?
Yeah, simple answer is yes, very much so. You know, there VOCs, it's a class of compounds, and we routinely monitor about 20 of them at any of these locations, and some are what we call tracers. They're specific for a certain emissions category. Others are tracers of something else. Others are tracers of gasoline. Some are tracers of burning. Some are tracers of oil and gas, hydrocarbon plumes. And by looking at each of these VOCs individually, by separating them one by one, very selectively at very high sensitivities of behavior. We see them all the time. You know, the lowest level are still high enough for us to quantify them. We can pinpoint pretty well where the emissions are coming from and what the emission sources are. Even between, you know, one type of gas, natural gas versus another type of gas, you look at the ratios, you know, how much propane is there in, you know, in relation to ethane. Just like, you know, your fingers, you know, they all have certain lengths, and the ratio is pretty constant. You know, your thumb is most likely a little bit shorter than your index finger, but that changes in some people, you know, with that ratio. And we look at that. And by doing so many measurements over and over for the VOCs every hour, that's 8,000-9,000 measurements a year. We get so much data that we can differentiate this depending on wind direction. You know, it looks this way from there. It looks differently when it's coming from there. You know, by having this massive amount of data, and using statistical tools, software programs that are available, where you can feed in thousands of measurements and look at each individual sample in these ratios and then do statistical analysis. We've gotten pretty good at it, and we're getting better still every month. So many of these analysis I've shown in some of these previous presentations build on that. And it's not just me, you know, the whole community is more and more using these VOC signatures to differentiate sources and even atmospheric reaction processes to learn more, you know, how much do these VOCs contribute to health effects and also to ozone production. So, sorry, long answer.
No, it's perfectly fine. I think it just highlights why laymen like me need apps like what Christian is helping us put together to understand all of this very useful but rather complicated data. So thank you for that. With that, I'm going to close out today's events. I'm going to share a couple of resources for you guys here. I'm going to try and share my screen, and if it doesn't work, maybe Logan can help me. It wasn't working out earlier. Could you guys see that? You can?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, great. Well, now I can't see it.
No.
Actually, we'll just have Logan share it if that's okay.
I know, I'll get it up for you.
Thank you. When I share it with you, I stop being able to see it for some reason. And I swear we practiced, and this is just par for the course for this type of thing. So on the next slide there, you'll see a QR code to our sign-on letter that is for trying to implement air quality monitoring in Larimer County. So if you feel passionate that we should be adding that extra data point and kind of getting the ball rolling in Larimer County, Fort Collins, please help us by signing and sharing this letter. We'll do the next slide, Logan. And this is a new petition that we've put together with the help of Mike Foote to try to address a couple of big permits that would definitely contribute to our cumulative air quality. And we are trying to get heard by the COGCC in denying these permits. You know, they're in the hundreds of wells. So we want to make sure to get community voices involved in this. So if you can scan that QR code, it'll take you to that petition. To tell the COGCC to deny the Bronco and Aurora comprehensive area plans. We'll do the next one, Logan. If you want to get more involved with either Larimer Alliance or Colorado Rising, those are our email addresses. Please feel free to contact us if you have any questions or concerns. And then one more slide. If you have specific concerns to share with Larimer County Board of Commissioners or the Fort Collins City Council, that's their contact information so that we can hopefully get air quality monitoring on the agenda. And one more. Sorry, this isn't very intuitive at all. We just want to thank you for attending here today. I know it was a long seminar, and we wanted to make sure that we gave it the time that this topic needs. So if you know of somebody who wasn't able to attend, be sure to share the link once we send it out to you so that they can catch up on it. And we look forward to continuing to have conversations like this. If you feel so inclined, we work on donations. And so if you would like to donate to either the Larimer Alliance or Colorado Rising for Communities, that is how you would do it. And these donations, at least speaking from Colorado Rising's perspective, they help us to continue organizing efforts around the state and support communities that are disproportionately impacted by oil and gas. They help us to continue with our public education efforts regarding the impact of oil and gas, such as today's seminar. And they also help us with things like the air quality monitoring app and other efforts we are taking part in to educate and help the public. So that's it for tonight, folks. Thanks so much for being here. Ed, do you want to share a few concluding words with us?
Right, you are. That does conclude our discussion for this evening's webinar. I'd like to thank all of you for your interesting questions in this critical overview of air quality issues in Northern Colorado. I'd also like to express our deep appreciation to our primary speakers and the participants in the panel discussion for sharing many valuable insights and promoting this important conversation. My cap is off to Sandra and Kate from Colorado Rising for moderating this webinar, and also their tech guru, Logan Tyler, for their able handling of the technical staging of this event. I was going to mention the petitions as well, but you all have beat me to the punch. So thank you all once again on behalf of the Larimer Alliance and Colorado Rising. We will be publicizing when the recording is made available, but you can always go onto our websites and say, hey, when's the recording coming? And go from there. Thank you again. Be well, stay safe, and take care, folks.
Bye, y'all. Thank you so much.